From the outside, our house seemed ordinary, the kind of place people drive by and think, "What a lovely home." The garden was neat, the windows gleamed in the sun, and neighbors waved politely when they passed. Visitors often complimented my parents, calling them kind, upstanding people. No one had any idea that behind those closed doors, a storm raged, a storm I had endured for all 18 years of my life. My father's temper was a force of nature, unpredictable and violent. I learned early to anticipate it, to tread carefully, to never speak unless spoken to, and even then, to choose my words as if walking on glass. A slight misstep, a careless glance, or a misunderstood word could set him off. The punishments varied, from verbal tirades that shook the house to blows that left marks on my body and scars on my soul. There were belts, wooden spoons, open hands, and fists. Once, after a particularly harsh punishment, I hid in the small crawl space under the stairs for hours, my arms wrapped around my trembling body, listening to him rage in the living room. And my mother watched. Sometimes she looked away, pretending not to notice. Other times, her eyes filled with tears, but she did nothing. She never stepped between us, never offered protection. Her silence was deafening, and it taught me a cruel lesson. If the people meant to love you don't, then survival is your only responsibility. I used to lie awake at night wondering if she didn't care, or if she feared him too much to act. Either way, I was left alone, facing a tempest no child should ever face. School became my escape. I buried myself in books and assignments, my teachers impressed by my quiet diligence. I learned to smile and nod, laugh with friends, and answer questions confidently. Nobody ever suspected the black and blue truths hidden under my sleeves or the knots in my stomach that never went away. I perfected the art of concealment, bruises covered with long sleeves in summer, fake stories about accidental falls, feigned innocence when asked. I became a master of deception, but inside, the pain festered, growing sharper with every unprotected hit and every look of indifference from my mother. Even as a child, a part of me began to plot. I wasn't thinking about revenge in the childish sense of retaliation. I was thinking about survival, about keeping myself safe, about keeping my mind intact while my body endured. I watched my father closely, studying his habits, noting when he relaxed, when he became irritable, when he looked away. Every detail was recorded silently in my mind. I learned to anticipate his anger and avoid the worst of it, but I also learned something deeper. I could endure. I could survive, and maybe one day I could reclaim the power he had stolen from me. Sleep was never truly rest. I would lie in bed, listening to the house breathe in the quiet night, replaying the day's events in my mind. I whispered promises to myself, words no one else would hear. I will not be broken. I will not be controlled. One day I will be free. Those whispered oaths became a quiet mantra, a fragile lifeline through years of fear and pain. By the time I turned 18, I had grown strong, not in muscle, but in mind. I had learned the most important lesson. The people who are supposed to protect you may fail, but your spirit can never be taken without your consent. And in that realization, a new feeling began to take root. An ember that was neither fear nor despair, but something far more potent, resolve. A patient burning resolve to one day confront the past, to take back what had been stolen from me. In the silence of my room, under the dim light of a single lamp, I made a vow that would guide me for years to come. My father would never again hold power over me, and my mother would finally see the truth of what she had allowed. I didn't know how or when, but I knew it would happen. And that knowledge, small and fierce, became the first spark of a fire that no one could extinguish. Teenage years were a battlefield of their own. By then, I had learned to anticipate my father's rage with a frightening accuracy. Every word I spoke, every movement I made, was calculated to avoid triggering him. But avoiding punishment didn't mean escaping fear. It only meant learning to survive within it. I had become a master of disguise, a performer who could hide the storm raging inside beneath a carefully constructed mask. At school, I was the quiet, polite student. I smiled, participated in clubs, excelled in my studies, and even made friends. Teachers praised my diligence. Friends admired my seeming calm and reliability. Nobody suspected the bruises hidden under long sleeves, the flinches at sudden movements, or the nights spent staring at the ceiling, replaying every cruel word my father had thrown at me. I had learned to lie convincingly, not just to others, but sometimes to myself, to survive each day without breaking. At home, the abuse continued. I remember one evening when I had stayed up late reading in my room. My father came in, demanding to know why the lights were still on. When I told him I had homework, he sneered, calling me lazy and ungrateful. The slap came quickly, followed by the belt. Pain seared through me, but I didn't cry out. I had learned that crying only prolonged the suffering. Instead, I went to the bathroom later, silently counting the marks on my skin, washing off the evidence, and swearing to myself that he would never see me truly broken. And my mother, she remained a ghost of intervention. Sometimes she whispered for him to stop. Sometimes her lips trembled, but she never acted. Her presence was a reminder that even love could betray, that protection could fail. Her silence became a bitter lesson. If no one else would save me, I had to save myself. I had to survive, and one day, I had to reclaim what had been stolen. So I began to build a secret life, one where my mind was free even if my body was trapped. I read voraciously, devouring stories of courage, resilience, and justice. I imagined a version of myself that was strong, unafraid, and in control. I practiced patience, learning to wait for the right moments, to observe carefully, and to store every insult, every blow, and every betrayal for a time when they would no longer hold power over me. I became a strategist in my own life, quietly planning, silently sharpening my resolve. I also learned the art of smiling while dying inside. I laughed with friends, shared jokes, and pretended everything was normal. People assumed I was happy. They assumed I was safe. No one knew that every conversation, every step outside my home, was a carefully choreographed act. I had to be convincing because survival depended on it. By the time I reached the cusp of adulthood, I had perfected my mask. I had a reputation for being polite, obedient, and unassuming, the perfect child on the surface, the storm survivor underneath. But behind the mask, the fire of revenge smoldered quietly. I didn't think about lashing out impulsively. I knew that true power came from patience. Every insult my father had thrown, every punch, every word of betrayal, became fuel for a fire I would unleash when the time was right. Even in those years, I began imagining the day when I could confront him, not as a frightened child, but as a fully grown, unshakable adult. I imagined the satisfaction of standing firm while he realized, perhaps too late, that the power he had wielded over me was gone forever. And I imagined my mother's face, finally registering the truth of the years she had allowed to happen, and perhaps, for the first time, feeling the weight of what she had ignored. By masking my pain, I had learned not only to survive, but to cultivate a dangerous strength. I had turned every hurt into resolve, every betrayal into strategy. And in the quiet corners of my mind, I began to understand something crucial. Revenge is not loud, not impulsive. It is deliberate. It is patient. It is waiting for the right moment when those who hurt you are most unprepared, most vulnerable. And I was learning, every day, how to wait. Adulthood arrived like a quiet sunrise, subtle and inevitable. I packed my bags and left the house that had been both my home and my prison. The world outside was vast, unfamiliar, and terrifying in ways that no belt, slap, or shouted insult had ever been. But it was also liberating. For the first time, I could breathe without flinching. For the first time, I could exist without constantly calculating how to survive someone else's anger. I built a life carefully, deliberately, as if each choice was a brick in a fortress protecting my soul. I pursued education, earning degrees that felt like armor against the past. I forged friendships, relationships, and connections that reminded me what it was to be human, to be free, to be loved. I learned to enjoy small victories, the warmth of a cup of coffee on a quiet morning, the sound of laughter without fear, the feeling of walking down the street without anticipating a storm. But the past never truly let go. It lurked in quiet moments, in memories that appeared unbidden, in flashbacks that made my stomach twist. I thought about my father's face, the way his eyes would flare with anger, the cruel satisfaction he seemed to take in my pain. I thought about my mother, her silence, her inability, or unwillingness, to protect me. Those memories were no longer chains but fuel. They reminded me why I had to endure, why I had to wait, and why one day I would reclaim the power he had stolen. I watched him from a distance carefully. Social media, mutual acquaintances, chance conversations, each piece of information was collected, catalogued, and analyzed. He had grown older, slower, more arrogant in ways that were almost laughable. He assumed I was still under his control, still the timid child who flinched at his shadow. He assumed my mother's loyalty to him had kept me compliant. He didn't know, and he never suspected, the fire that had been quietly growing inside me for years. I built a life that reflected the opposite of what he had tried to instill in me. Where he had enforced fear, I cultivated confidence. Where he had imposed anger, I nurtured patience. Where he had created pain, I surrounded myself with beauty, intelligence, and independence. Every achievement became a silent act of defiance, every success a reminder that he had not won. The world I created was mine, and no one, not him, not anyone, could take it away. And yet, the thought of revenge lingered, like a shadow at the edge of every bright moment. I didn't plan violence. That was never necessary. True revenge would not be in striking him physically, but in revealing the truth of his cruelty and the strength he could not destroy. It would be a reckoning, and I would orchestrate it perfectly. Then came the news his health was failing. A minor stroke, they said, but enough to make people whisper about mortality, about the fragility of life. I didn't feel relief, nor sorrow, just a quiet awareness that timing finally might be on my side. The years of planning, of patience, of silent observation were approaching a moment of fruition. I began to imagine the ceremony, his memorial, his funeral, whatever guise it would take. I pictured the faces of those who had respected him, who had admired him, who had never known the truth of the home he ruled with fists and fear. And I pictured myself entering that space, calm and composed, carrying not grief, but the quiet satisfaction of someone who had survived, who had grown stronger, who had endured what no child should endure. My mother would be there, of course. I imagined her tears, her grief, and the subtle shift when she realized that I was not the fragile, broken child she thought she had failed. She would finally understand, even if just for a moment, the years I had endured alone, and the resolve that had been forged in that crucible. In that quiet anticipation, I understood something essential. Revenge is not about anger. It is about control. It is about reclaiming the power that was stolen. It is about transforming pain into strength and betrayal into triumph. I had waited 18 years, and now every detail, every calculation, every memory was converging toward a single purpose. And I was ready. The day of the ceremony arrived with the weight of inevitability. I stood outside the venue, taking in the quiet buzz of mourners, the flowers, the hushed conversations. People I barely knew offered condolences to my mother, patting her shoulder, murmuring about my father's kindness and strength. And I walked among them, a ghost in plain sight, my heart calm, my expression neutral. They didn't know the truth, and that ignorance was the most powerful weapon I carried. Inside, the room smelled of polished wood and faint perfume, a stark contrast to the chaos of my childhood home. My mother sat near the front, her shoulders trembling, tears rolling down her cheeks. I approached slowly, letting her see me, letting her feel the presence of the child she had raised, and perhaps the one she had failed. She glanced at me, startled by my composure, by the serenity that seemed unnatural in the midst of grief. She had known me as frightened, broken, compliant, but that girl no longer existed. I took a seat among the crowd, listening to speeches that praised my father's generosity, his devotion to family, and the legacy he supposedly left behind. Faces nodded solemnly. Friends, colleagues, distant relatives, all unaware that the man they eulogized had spent nearly 2 decades terrorizing the very child now sitting before them. Each word they spoke was a lie, but a lie I would dismantle carefully, deliberately. When it was my turn, I walked to the podium with the calm of someone who had rehearsed this moment for years. The audience's eyes turned toward me, expectant, waiting for tears, waiting for weakness. I gave them none. I began quietly, deliberately, recounting memories that no one else could imagine, the endless nights of fear, the hidden bruises, the words that cut deeper than fists. My voice was steady, measured, each syllable carrying the weight of truth. I spoke not in rage, but in clarity, exposing the years of abuse that had shaped my life. I described how I had survived, how I had endured, and how I had transformed the pain into resilience. My mother's hands froze in her lap, her tears blurred, but her eyes widened with realization. She finally saw the child she had allowed to suffer, the strength she had underestimated, and the resolve I had nurtured in secret. The room shifted uncomfortably. People whispered, exchanged glances, and some shifted in their seats as the image of the man they had admired crumbled in silence. I did not shout, I did not accuse, I simply told the truth. And truth, in its quiet force, carried a weight far heavier than any blow my father had ever delivered. I looked around the room and met my father's gaze, or rather, the empty space where he had sat in pride, assuming his authority still held sway. He would never hear my words, never realize the full measure of his failure, and in that I found a strange peace. My revenge was not vengeance in the conventional sense, it was revelation. It was taking the power he had wielded over me and showing the world that it had always belonged to me, not him. When I finished, the room was silent. My mother's sobs were soft now, almost reverent, as if mourning not just him, but the years of lost protection, lost awareness, lost courage that she had failed to foster. And I realized in that moment that my victory was complete, not through violence, not through anger, but through endurance, through truth, and through the unshakable strength that had carried me from a terrified child to the woman standing firmly before them. I left the podium quietly, my steps measured. I didn't need applause nor acknowledgement. My satisfaction came from the knowledge that I had finally reclaimed the power he had tried to steal, that I had transformed betrayal into triumph, and that the child he had tried to break now walked free, whole, and unafraid. Outside, the sun fell softly across the cemetery, warm on my face. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of years lift, the chains of my past shatter silently. The shadows of my childhood home no longer followed me. I had survived, I had conquered, and I had finally proven, not to him, but to myself, that I was stronger than the fear he had instilled. For the first time in 18 years, I smiled not a mask, not a survival tactic, but a true, quiet, victorious smile. The fire that had burned silently within me had become light, and I walked forward into the life I had earned.